people who have written their question in the chat to unmute, pose the question themselves, and perhaps also allude to who might be the best speaker to which of the speakers the question is addressed. So I think we have first Borut. If Borut, you are still with us, I would ask you to unmute and you can pose the question yourself. No, Borut?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Okay, Slovenia is a bit specific, I think, because we don't want wind turbines. We don't want river dams. So I'm asking, what is a timely alternative to coal? Because we are also against using nuclear energy for both of speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Borut. So the question on a timely alternative to both of the speakers. I think you've both touched upon this topic already, but you can maybe say a few more things.
I'll just add from my perspective, certainly understand that there are challenges on wind deployment in Slovenia. Given the modelling we've seen and the wind and the wind potential and the solar potential, there's certainly more that can be done on the wind side, and definitely a lot more that can be deployed on solar. Given the cost reduction, the cost curves, this is very, very competitive. And we're not just talking about large scale solar, but also on rooftops, on houses, on commercial buildings, industrial sites, etc. So I do think there's a lot more solar deployment that could happen in Slovenia. And you mentioned in terms of timeliness, and that's certainly one of the fastest things to deploy. So I think there's a large opportunity that's being missed there, but there will be challenges, of course.
Maybe just to add a comment on bounding what a model can tell you, or bounding a benchmark or a place where we want to be, with reconciling that with what we need to do to get there. I think what we do see are strong messages which emerge both globally and regionally on the diminishing role of fossils and the need to scale up alternatives. And while this might have specific challenges or barriers in different countries, I think a commitment to policies such as a strong coal phase out actually facilitates that conversation of what replaces it in a stronger manner, right? Because you have to have a strong message on at the exit of the incumbent if you want to have a discussion on how you facilitate entry of other competing technologies, right? So I think from this presentation, we have an overview of where we need to be. We have an overview of the options and their cost effectiveness, but I would defer to you and others who actually have more of a sense of what's happening on the ground to then figure out how we get there. So I think you can recognize the realities as they are, but also recognize the strong message which a coal phase out or a message that we are exiting coal in our system can send to shift the frame of that discussion to be more inclusive of what we can do, not what we have done.
Thank you to both. We have another question, and it's coming from Daniel. So if you're with us, Daniel, you can please unmute and ask away.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the both presentation. They were quite thorough and a lot of information we got from them. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of comments. I'm afraid that I cannot really point out all of them, but maybe I can just start with the first one that I already wrote in the chat. How did you really take into account one of the basic principles of international law and also of environmental protection that is in the Paris Agreement, that is common but differentiated responsibilities as respective capabilities and also national circumstances. As pointed out also by Mr. Taučar, Slovenia is quite specific, and there are, let's say, really strong specific national circumstances that we have to take into account, because the modeling that we get is quite different when you put it into the perspective of national circumstances. And maybe just to comment on some, let's say, points that were made. Charles said about wind and solar as an alternative to coal. When we were preparing the NECP, the solar was kind of modeled to the maximum. In the years 2012 to 13, there was about approximately 120, 130 megawatts of solar installed in 1 year. And to 2030, we have, let's say, a target that we should install about 150 per year. And we got a lot of comments that it's simply not possible. We don't have human resources for that amount of new solar capacity to be installed by 2030. About the wind, we had 106 megawatts of the target 2020. Today we have 5. And that is mostly on account of the opposition of the local population as well as the non-governmental organizations. So when we were talking about wind, we went a bit higher, and we could not really afford to go higher than it was then proposed at the end, because it was quite clear that part of the non-governmental organizations were against. And when you didn't mention hydro, you mentioned that Slovenia has good hydro conditions, but you didn't really mention hydro as an alternative. Just to make a point, in the initial proposal of the NECP, we had 3 to 4 hydropower plants. They were taken out of the proposal because they were assessed as environmentally not acceptable. So when you go to the ground, the picture is quite different. I would really like to see Slovenia on the left-hand side of the graphs that we've seen. And from that point of view, I would say that Slovenian NECP is not so unambitious when you take into account all the national circumstances. And for example, we have proposed 2 days ago, we put the strategy into public consultation, and the date that is proposed is 2033. And we are afraid, and I'm quite sure that colleagues can confirm that, the major opposition will come from the local population, and quite interestingly, from the Ministry of Environment. So just some food for thought. But thank you for the presentations. They were good, and definitely a lot of data that should also be taken on board when modeling and thinking about our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So yeah, whoever wants to take, I think the question was more on how did you take into account common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances when it comes to the coal phase out? So I assume this is more for Gauro in terms of modeling.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I have a short answer and a long answer, and a caveat. The first caveat is I think you have a much better overview of what ground level situations can be, and speaking about, or from where I'm sitting, speaking about common but differentiated responsibilities or equitable principles can sometimes be meaningless and be lost in numbers. So I also want to significantly caveat what I'm going to say, recognizing that. But another hat which I do wear, and another set of, or another part of our research, which we do over here, is assessing precisely this question of what are fair emission reduction targets for different countries. And what we did present to you were essentially insights derived from cost-effective trajectories. So they actually take into account only where it is cost-effective to do certain actions, but don't speak about distributional consequences at all. But when you start to take distributional consequences into account, and here I would zoom out not just from within the EU, but looking at the EU vis-a-vis the rest of the world, you get to emission allocations for EU countries, OECD countries, which are already close to zero by 2030. When you take into account metrics of historic responsibility and other metrics. So obviously these metrics are simplistic and they don't reflect every individual country's circumstances in the numbers. But when you do zoom out a little bit, you already reach a zero by 2030, which means you're either physically reducing emissions to zero in 2030, or you are reducing it rapidly and bridging the gap by providing finance to other countries, which if we then zoom out have also significant, if not more stringent challenges along the same themes. So I think that we don't take it into account here, but if we did, you would actually see more stringent requirements coming out in terms of contributions. And this is just a perspective which I can provide, but of course, understanding that even within the EU, circumstances vary quite dramatically. What this then ends up meaning in terms of these broad benchmarks are that you end up with similar benchmarks for groups of countries that might not necessarily reflect redistribution within these countries. But then I would highlight the second part of my presentation, which is even when you account for differences between broad regional groupings, you have coal phase-out dates that are really compressed because coal is the low-hanging fruit. And if we don't get rid of coal, then that requires you to do more costly actions. What this then means is that it's less a question of whether you need to achieve it globally, but from a fairness perspective, it is how much support do you need to facilitate those actions, or where is that support coming from? And on that, I would, of course, defer to people who are more oriented with the EU framework, but I understand that those conversations on how we can provide support and what that transition can look like to not leave behind people has been gaining quite some momentum in the EU of late. On the second aspect on hydro, I would defer to Charles. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you, Gauro. Yeah, Charles, if you have anything more to add on this renewable side, perhaps even more particularly solar, wind, that are sort of technologies that are basically untapped in Slovenia. Yeah, so if you have any comments on the comments.
I think just to refer back to Gaurov's point, actually, that this is why the challenges that are quite fairly raised with deploying additional wind and solar based on opposition from various different stakeholders for different reasons. This is why it's so important that we get ambitious coal phase out dates committed to by government to really sharpen the focus on what needs to be done. And there will be trade-offs. There will be trade-offs. Coal needs to go on from a climate reason, and I think it's certainly a discussion to be had. I can't influence that much, but it's a national discussion at how best to do that. But I would just emphasize and reiterate Gaurov's point about the importance of setting these targets so that filters through all levels of government and stakeholders that are involved and aware of the challenges ahead.
Thank you, Charles.
Can I have a short reply?
Oh, yeah, of course.
It's not really a reply, it's just a comment. It's not, I guess it's not written in the NECP, but nevertheless, if all the measures and instruments that are in the NECP on renewables were implemented, Slovenia would come close to 30%. But the target was not adopted in the NECP exactly because of the problems that we had in the periods 2010 to 2020. And as you all know, the renewables target is obligatory. In the case the target is not reached at the EU level, then of course the countries that lag behind at the end have to pay. So that was one of the reasons why Slovenia didn't really write the number 30% to the NECP. We wrote only 27, but taking into account all the measures and instruments that are proposed in the NECP, with their full implementation, we would come close to 30%. And the second point, one of the key measures is that a national study should be prepared in the next 2 years, taking on board all the potential of renewables in Slovenia, trying to see where it's possible to do the spatial planning of the renewables, because I guess that everybody knows that in Slovenia we have 38% of Natura 2000, and it's one of the, let's say, obstacles to spatial planning of renewables in the past and still is. So we are trying to solve that puzzle, and hopefully in 2023 and 2024 we will be more ambitious also by increasing our renewables target. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Before I'll inviting Alan to pose his question, yeah, maybe just a thought that popped up in my head while listening to the exchange right now is actually, yeah, that question coming from Daniel's comment on maybe this hesitance from various actors or skepticism towards projects for solar or wind, is exactly that question of how much would a really full-fledged governmental strategy and support for coal phase out, wind, solar phase in, actually add to facilitate trust and non-criticism and being on board with the energy transition in Slovenia from various actors. Because so far this hasn't been, energy transition has not been, let's say, a coherent strategy and also narrative that would be presented to the population. So maybe just one thought from my side, but I'll go back to just purely moderating now. So please, Lan, if you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. First, I'd like to commend both of the presenters, great presentations. But a question popped up into my head. Usually the main argument against renewable energy is there will be great job loss or from fossil fuel sector, and because of such a rapid decline in coal use, there probably won't be enough time to reinstate or re-educate the workers of the coal sector in such a short time. So my question is how to present this idea to the public, telling them that yes, in the beginning you will lose jobs, but for a greater goal. And also, do you have some examples of transformation of those jobs to those in the green sector? Thanks. Yeah, maybe it's, yeah, who feels, perhaps Charles, or who feels more comfortable addressing this question? I know you're not probably experts on the various measures of just transition, but you can give it a try.
Yeah, I'm happy to say very briefly, but with the caveat that indeed we're certainly not experts on just transition, but my perception is just from a kind of technology level is that there's now a really good body of research that renewables investments create a much larger number of jobs per megawatt of installed capacity or per investment than fossil alternatives. So even kind of multipliers of 2-3 times the number of jobs will be created with renewables investments. And it's not to say that those jobs will be perfectly matched up, and this is why we need the funding and support and the regional development that goes with the just transition programs to provide that targeted intervention. But I think it is something worth emphasizing that it is likely there will be job losses in a specific sector, but they will be more than compensated with job growth in other sectors. But there are obviously winners and there are losers, and that's why we need the important work of cohesion and transition, just transition programs to support that that transition.
Maybe just one additional comment. I do think, first, I think we're learning a lot from you, precisely because we can provide insights on what models say or modeling frameworks say, but get a lot more context from your side on actual ground level context, which matters for some of these questions. But another frame which I think is important is to not just compare a lack of a structural change with a structural change for coal, but to ask yourself the question of what kind of structural change you want. So given cost considerations and pressures, there are also two other types of transitions which could happen. One is a structured transition where you accept that coal has a diminishing role and plan for it and try to mitigate some of those harms, or to let it be driven by exogenous circumstances where it will anyway happen but be unstructured and you're unprepared for it. So I think when you see the option space, it's not just the option of continuing with coal and the way it is for as long as possible versus getting rid of it in a rapid manner. But I think there is a midway which you also have to compare it to, which is what would happen if we didn't plan for it, given what we see around us in other countries and what we see in terms of increasing urgency to act on climate change. So maybe just as a frame of reference, which goes away just purely from the numbers and more to framing, I think it's important to consider that the value of that comparison as well, while deciding how fast you and how disruptive you see the transition.
Thank you. And Lan, I don't know if you've seen, actually, there was a link posted in the chat, some possibly interesting for your question. And actually, I think this, the last thoughts of Gauro kind of lead us into in a good way to to Zala's question. But before Zala's question, I see that the Borut, who was with us before, also had a follow-up question. I would say. So, Borut, if you can ask your follow-up question now, and Zala, you can get ready to be next.
Just a short question. Is burning waste still a renewable source, like in Denmark, Austria, and this countries? Thank you.
So, question on burning waste as renewable source of energy.
Not an expert, but my short comment based on what I do know is that it does still have significant air pollution consequences, and a lot of questions on where your waste is being sourced from. So the first comment on that would be, it depends, but in most cases, no. But this is my opinion, probably a bit uninformed.
Just to add to that, the question with waste is always about what would otherwise have happened to the waste if you hadn't burnt it. And in the long term, waste burning still does emit CO2 emissions. And so we can reduce those via circular economy, increasing recycling, etc. So I don't think waste burning should be seen as a long-term solution, certainly not without CCS.
Thank you. Zala, if you're ready, we are ready for your question, so go ahead.
Thank you, Katja. Yeah, I'm Zala. I work as a campaigner for Europe Beyond Coal, which is an NGO coalition working to make Europe coal-free by 2030. And as Katja said, yeah, Gauro had a really good point that kind of reflects what I was looking for in a question to Charles. So basically, because Charles was analyzing a lot the national energy and climate plans, but they are usually one thing is, as Charles also mentioned, is they were put together in a completely different policy frame, European policy frame. So they're already outdated in terms of the climate targets that they're addressing. But putting that aside, they're also, looking at what the energy market is now. They're also being outpaced by reality, just what's happening with the energy market, what's happening with coal's economics, with renewables economics. And if we look at in Europe, at the 14 countries that are already, or 15 that already committed to a coal phase out, 14 have a Paris compatible phase out announcement, which is 2030, and only Germany has 2038. And there we can see how if you have a late coal phase out date and plan for it, you can be hit hard by the reality on what's happening in the energy market, where the newest coal power plants are being closed this year. And they were planned to be closed in 2033, I think, in Germany. So, you know, there's this imbalance between the plans when you look at what is needed in terms of climate target, but it's also the imbalance in what the reality, in reality is happening on the market. So I was wondering, maybe more for Charles, like if you put that thought into putting the plans aside, what will actually happen by 2030 with this, you know, energy, with the energy market, with the reality behind our also Slovenian, but also the European energy mix. And then I had an additional question, but maybe that's a bit unfair to have two, because it's not related. It's about the financial prospect of Šoštanj in Slovenia, if there's any comments around that. But I guess there's more people who want to ask questions, so I'll just leave it to the first one. Thank you.
Thanks, Ola. Yeah, so it's fair to say, I mean, I showed on the chart that the current national energy and climate plans are a very long way away from where we need to be in terms of coal use, even for the EU's own 55% target. A couple of things to, I suppose, respond to in that sense. I think it's fair to say that when Germany set out their coal phase out law, they did so in a way they thought would be stable and bring as many parties on board. The problem is, by setting a date that was so far inconsistent with the requirements of the Paris Agreement and not reflecting where climate policy would be moving, then actually by setting a date so far away from 2030, they made the whole process much more unstable. Whereas coal phase outs that are much closer to 2030, there's much more acceptance at a political level across all the stakeholders in the transition that date is fine. You know, 2030, there's not the push from 2030 earlier is a kind of nice to have, whereas everyone is focusing on pushing everything that's beyond 2030 to something that is much closer to Paris compatible. So there's a stability element to a phase out and bringing all partners on board and kind of going close to what is needed for Paris. In terms of what's happening in the energy market, really in coal's perspective, it's all about carbon prices. So the game has changed for coal and carbon prices, and that's why you're seeing this wave of coal closures coming first, because effectively, if you have coal price setting in many hours in your electricity mix, you are going to have high electricity prices now, because it's the most emissions intensive, and there's a huge pressure on the economics of coal. And so I fully expect to see those coal phase out dates and coal phase out projections for 2030 come down really quite rapidly, and we're already seeing evidence of that. So from the Polish energy plan recently released is very unambitious in certain ways, but already reflecting the high energy prices. There's a huge reduction in coal from what was planned just 2 years ago in the high carbon price scenario. So I think, to summarize, this is major transformation in the economics from carbon pricing, and this is going to speed up coal phase out much further than much quicker than what was initially expected even 2 or 3 years ago. And the EU Commission has set a very robust view on the need for reform of carbon pricing. And so we expect that the high prices that have been brought into place now are likely to persist at this level or higher throughout this decade.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, this is already kind of putting us on track for the second part of today's event, where I expect that the economics will be more of a topic of discussion, hearing from utilities and their kind of reasoning behind. But we do have, for this Q&A session, we have two more questions. And I think, yeah, we have enough time to probably address both. First, we have a question that came through our Facebook live stream. So I'll just read it out. Andre is asking, when we say we have to be more ambitious, we all know that means more money for renewables. What is your estimate how much of GDP must Slovenia contribute until 2030 to achieve 1.5 degrees goal? I have a feeling you're not able to give us like a financial estimate for Slovenia, but perhaps Charles, Gauro, any comments on this, let's say, finances behind the energy transition related to coal phase out in terms of a GDP comparison, perhaps regionally, globally?
So yeah, I certainly won't be able to add specifics on the Slovenian situation to 2030, but what we've seen in the last 10 years in terms of energy reduction, cost reduction, not just in wind and solar, but also in the technologies that are required to integrate those into a grid, is that we can now start viably talking about a total energy system cost that is lower than the fossil fuel alternative. So not only is the net zero compatible energy system zero carbon, then whereas 10 years ago it was always how much the subsidy is going to cost, how much the transition going to cost, but actually there is a cost, but it's likely now that once you look at the total system costs over the full duration and 2050, those costs will be lower than the fossil fuel alternative, and certainly if you incorporate carbon prices. So I think it's important that one challenge is that if you just focus on the costs, especially in the short term, and don't focus on the benefits as well, there are costs, but there are also benefits in things like obviously reduced climate risk, reduced air pollution, and then in the long term you pay in renewables and solar, for example, you're paying quite a lot upfront in capital costs, but then your cost of running that system and your resilience increase over time.
Thank you. And we have one last question that is also for Charles. So Luca, if you can unmute and ask away.
Yeah. It was just a comment, an observation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. It was just observation in the last chart when you had the list of the most clean grids in 2030. France was a clear winner according to this chart, especially according to the size of the country, and
yeah, I think you mentioned in your comment it's partly because of or mostly because of France's high share of nuclear in the mix. That's correct.
Yeah, and actually I also remember, like, maybe just tied into the France story, that on the chart, I think it was the nuclear chart, where you had the sort of estimates for the next decade in terms of nuclear production, that France is behind Germany in terms of decreasing, right? Like about 40% of decrease coming from nuclear production. So I guess France still stays the winner on the clean due to its decreasing and existing nuclear fleet. And if I understand correctly, not because of new nuclear builds, or I mean, just that this story of France, if we understand it based on your charts.
Yeah, so the current plan in France is to reduce nuclear to around about half of the generation mix by 2035, and that's being replaced by wind and solar. So in France, it's a story of kind of one zero carbon electricity to another one, and that's the transition that's taking place. Whereas in other countries, it's fossil fuels to renewables generally.
Are there any more comments, follow-up questions for Charles or Gauro? We still have, I mean, we're remarkably on time, I would say. But yeah, another minute or two, I'm sure we can squeeze in. So yeah, if anybody has a question, please. Okay, we have one more question, and let's have this as our final question, if it's okay with everybody. So Andrea, let's close out the discussion with you. So you can unmute.
Hi, is electricity from nuclear power plants also high taxed to ensure money to go into true renewables and systems for them? That means batteries, grids, etc. Or is anyone working on this? Thank you.
Yeah, Charles?
Just to say, I don't have any particular insights on that, but I would expect it's a very national story, depending on the national context and the design of the electricity market.
In our experience, if the EU says it, then it's done.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, for this open question that I'm sorry we're not able to perhaps address more on the taxation issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for everybody who've voiced their questions. Thank you to Charles and Gauro for their great presentations. As I said, all of you will be also send the presentations after the event. Maybe just a note, particularly to any journalists that are with us here today. So if you want to have also one-on-one conversation with presenters, I think they're all available to do so today in the coming days. So maybe if you have that interest, just let us know and we'll put you in contact. And now let's take a short break or about a 20-minute break. Come back at 12. I hope most of you will be able to join us again. And we will hear from, as I already mentioned, from representatives of two energy utilities sharing with us their story of transitioning from coal and giving us their, let's say, more business side of the equation. So thank you again and see you in about 20 minutes time.